Okay, good morning, everybody. I am really excited to welcome everybody back to the seminar on decline that is co-sponsored by the Università degli Studi-Firenze and by UCSD. This seminar series, as many of you know, is a year-long experiment, more or less, in providing a kind of bi-continental discussion of questions of what decline means in antiquity, broadly considered, so all time periods, all regions that we can touch upon. And so today's talk is, I believe we're moving towards the end of the series. So I think we have two more after today. But to introduce our speaker today, let me turn things over to Carlo Ferrari, and we will introduce the speaker. So Carlo, take it away.
Thank you very much, and I hope everybody can hear me. It's a great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Felege-Selam Yirga, who is assistant professor at the University of Tennessee. And Felege is a historian of the late antique Near East and Red Sea regions, who has recently completed his PhD at the Ohio State University with a dissertation entitled The Chronicle of John of Nikiu, Historical Writing in Post-Roman Egypt. Felege's main interest is the study of early Byzantine historiography and how people who did not live under the Roman Empire remember it and use its memory to forge their own religious and political identities. Felege is currently working on his first monograph, which is an expansion of his dissertation. And this project will examine how the first generation of people who lived in lands that had formerly been under the dominion of Rome remembered the Roman Empire, and how the reaction to the withdrawal of the Roman state affected the expression of their social and cultural identity. Felege has already received important grants and awards, such as the Dumbarton Oaks Junior Fellowship at the Harvard University in 2019, and the award from the Fritz Graf Fund for Ancient Mediterranean Religions at the Ohio State University in 2018. He has also participated to numerous conferences, mainly focused on late antique Christianity, Ethiopian and Byzantine history and historiography. The title of his presentation today is Post-Romans, Christian Historiography After Roman Hegemony, and I will gladly give him the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlo. And I want to thank as well Ed and Giovanni for giving me the opportunity to share this work. This particular portions are very much a work in progress, so I hope for many useful comments today. I also apologize, just now some sirens started passing by my office window, so if there's a lot of noise, I apologize for that. Let's get started. Today, I hope to delve into my conception of post-Roman Christian historical writing, considering in particular the topic of decline. John of Nikiu was very interested in the idea of decline after the collapse of Roman hegemony in Egypt. And in fact, this was a key historical concept to him. It must have been challenging for him to explain what had happened to his compatriots without slipping into apocalyptic thinking. Before the end of Roman hegemony in Egypt, the province had every right to be considered a core territory of the Roman Empire. Not only did its grain feed the empire, but its thinkers, both before and after Christianity, had an immense impact on the cultural and religious life of the empire. But when Roman hegemony ended there, suddenly, in 642, the Roman state didn't wither away or transform into something else, and the Arabs did not seize Constantinople. Instead, life simply went on, and following the brief Roman recapture of Alexandria in 646, there was no decline in real political terms, but for some of the Egyptian elite, fall in political terms, but for some of the Egyptian elite, it certainly felt that way. John was left to explain why he and his fellow countrymen were no longer Romans. And I think this really does reflect a crisis for someone like John. Here was a guy who, in many ways, thought like a Roman, read like a Roman, and spoke Coptic, a language that saw its full literary expression under Roman hegemony. And yet he was quite removed from this Roman hegemony in the late 8th century. He assumed that his readers could access Procopius and Agathias, presumably in Greek. And he also presumed they would find some profit in knowing the story of the rise of Aristomachus, Nikiu's hometown hero, from relative obscurity as a provincial aristocrat to a member of the Emperor Maurice's government. Yet John was not at all Roman. He never paid taxes to Romans, never dealt with a Roman magistrate, never sailed north to see its capital in its imperial splendor. So what was he doing with this text? Was this some kind of Coptic proto-national text, eager to cast barbs at Egypt's old Roman hegemons and its new Arab ones in equal measure? Or was this a pure Christian universal history, limited in its geographic range only by the author's own lack of sources? These problems ultimately left me tangled in questions of the emergence of Coptic identity and John's own Egyptianness, which did little ultimately, for me at any rate, to elucidate the content of the text or John of Nikiu's perception of Egypt and Egyptian history. So rather than trying to come to grips with how John identified himself, for example, as a Copt, as a bishop, as a Miaphysite, as a dhimmi, or as an overseer of monasteries, and how this identity shaped his work, I want to understand the way in which John of Nikiu made sense of his world in a point of crisis. I want to understand the mental model by which he hoped to explain to himself and others what had happened over the past, over the course of human history, and what he thought might happen next based on that model. The Chronicle, I believe, and much of John's source material for it, reflected Roman ideology, and in a post-Roman world, this existed as a vestigial intellectual or cultural appendage by which the Egyptian cultural and intellectual elite organized the world around them. In a different age, this framework, this cognitive mapping, might serve to reproduce a particular set of social relations or cultural and religious rituals and political discourses, the stuff, in other words, that constituted the Roman state, society, and culture. And by Roman, I of course mean the sort of broad Roman Empire. So this leaves us then with an excellent opportunity. John of Nikiu provides us with a fleeting glimpse at this vestigial post-Roman ideology, as expressed through the very Roman genre of the universal history, Chronicle. Today, just focusing on our Bishop of Nikiu, although I suspect there are others like it, I want to provide you with one vision of decline, which was expressed through an impartial assessment of what made Roman hegemony possible and why it deteriorated. I contend that John was someone whose perception of the wider world, of his Christianity, and of his new Arab hegemons was informed by a tacit understanding that Roman hegemony was in fact truly eternal, despite the evidence around him to the contrary. John clearly saw the situation in Christian Egypt as temporary in a grand historical sense. To the Bishop of Nikiu, early Islamic Egypt was an anomalous product of several mistakes made by the Roman state in the years after the Council of Chalcedon's decisions in 451, which had the cumulative effect of alienating the empire from its god, but strictly just for now. He also seeks to show his audience how they can hasten this return, hasten the Roman Empire's return. John's history explains to the reader, in emphatic terms, why one ought to live an ascetic life or adopt some degree of asceticism in order to hasten the return of Roman hegemony. Let me say from the outset that I think John's analysis was far from a popular one. And why would it be? For one, it claimed to be a history of humanity up to the present day that told its readers almost nothing about who the Arabs were and how they came to power in Syria, the Levant, and east into Iran. It instead spent an inordinate amount of time detailing the successive descent of the Roman state into chaos and its ultimate separation from Egypt as a result of doctrinal malfeasance. Considering these factors, it is almost miraculous that it was translated into Arabic, let alone later on into classical Ethiopic. Some of John's more popular contemporaries instead turned to other genres, for example, the ecclesiastical history, and I'm thinking in particular of the history of the patriarchs of Alexandria, in which they found continuity, hope, and most importantly, some flexibility in tracing the history of a persecuted Egyptian church that persisted for centuries, and to which the Roman state Indeed, all states were largely secondary. Others, writing several centuries after John, turned to Apocalypse, reading the arrival of the Arabs and the end of Roman hegemony as integral to the coming end of days. John was, I should note, actively hostile to any suggestion of the latter and makes little room for the former. But both ultimately had far more longevity and cultural currency in early Islamic Egypt than his work, than the Chronicle. Nevertheless, I think the Chronicle is worth examining, not only because it provides nuggets of useful information for the historian of early Islam or the Coptic Church, but because it tells us about what happens after the decline and fall, how the tools of the old world, the world before the fall, were applied to the two new scenarios. Before I continue, I think it's necessary just quickly to talk a little bit about who John was and the work he produced. The Chronicle was a world history, and by this I properly mean really a history of the Mediterranean, beginning with Adam and Eve and ending with the Arab conquest of Egypt by Ahmad ibn al-As in 642 CE, focusing in particular on the history of the Roman Empire and its Christian population. It was likely originally composed in Coptic, the indigenous language of Egypt, and the final stage of the ancient Egyptian language, which was written using a modified form of the Greek alphabet. This language had existed and developed alongside Greek in Egypt among both the educated elite in major cities, and especially among Egyptians in smaller towns and monasteries all the way into Upper Egypt. Eventually, the Coptic language became the dominant liturgical language of the Miaphysite Church and the language of much of its citizenry, particularly those in the countryside. I should note that the claim that the Chronicle was composed in Coptic is disputed. Some have suggested that the Chronicle was either originally composed in Greek or that parts of it were composed in Greek. And in some sense, I think this is true. John appears to have predominantly made use of Greek texts, although we'll see some Coptic examples later on. And in some instances, he appears to have been the first translator of these texts into Coptic. In terms of John himself, we know little about his ecclesiastical career and basically nothing of his early life. He was likely born after Byzantine rule in Egypt had already ended in 642, and he appears to have received an education in Greek. He likely came from a fairly wealthy family, perhaps somewhere in the city of Nikiu or elsewhere in the Nile Delta, but we have no other evidence for his socioeconomic background. He was bilingual and appeared to have some sort of a secular education in addition to his ecclesiastical training. We are told explicitly that he was familiar with monastic life and most likely spent his time as a monk before his elevation to the bishopric of Nikiu. John was, in many ways, the quintessential insider. He was a bishop of an important see in the late 7th century, and he is listed among the bishops present with the Coptic patriarch John III at his deathbed in 689 CE. He is mentioned in the history of the patriarchs of Alexandria among an assembly who sought to elect John III's successor. This assembly, which included a large group of bishops, clergy, and laity, apparently attempted to secure the election of a deacon named George from the town of Sakha to the patriarchy without the knowledge of Egypt's Muslim governor. Our sources disagree on the presence of John of Nikiu at the selection of George of Sakha. His contemporary, the Archdeacon George, who was the author of the history of the patriarchs of Alexandria for this particular period, places John squarely in the inner circle of influential bishops present at the death of John and the selection of George. However, Mina of Nikiu, John's successor, claims that John was present in Alexandria only for the enthronement of John III's eventual successor, Isaac, acting as a representative of all the bishops of Upper Egypt. Mena, who later describes John as a man, quote, wholly accomplished in the wisdom of God and men, may have wanted to minimize the role of his predecessor in a conspiracy to enthrone George of Sakha against John III's dying wish, while the Archdeacon George, on the other hand, may have sought to implicate John of Nikiu, among others. The paucity of sources surrounding this vital period leaves room for little more than speculation. We do know that John maintained his position as Bishop of Nikiu through the reign of Isaac I, John III's choicest successor. And when Isaac died in 692 CE, some 2 or 3 years after taking the throne, he was succeeded by Simeon I, a Syrian who was deeply unpopular among Egyptian Christians, according to the Archdeacon George. It is during Simeon's reign that John's career reached both its zenith and nadir. Simeon appointed John the Mudabbir, or administrator of the monasteries of Egypt. It is unclear what exactly this position might have entailed, but his appointment as Mudabbir must have represented a significant promotion for John. While previously he had acted as a kind of representative of the bishops of Upper Egypt, in one particular event, he was now given some degree of authority or control over all of Egypt's monastic communities, a significant upgrade in terms not only of geographic scope, but also of political influence. I want to explain a bit why. Egypt's monasteries had served as the home of several notable anti-Chalcedonian bishops, many of whom had been recruited from these monasteries by the Patriarch Peter IV, who reigned from 577 to 606 CE, in order to compete with the rapidly ballooning ranks of Egyptian bishops who had allied themselves with the Chalcedonian Patriarchate. Peter was the leader of what would later become the Egyptian Coptic Church. But at this point, the Miaphysite Church did not understand itself to be separate from the state-sponsored Chalcedonian Church, but rather something like a righteous community in exile, patiently biding their time until a more sympathetic emperor might ease restrictions on them, or even reverse the decisions of the Council of Chalcedon in 451. And they weren't alone. By the time the Arabs wrested control of Egypt from the Byzantines, as many as 8 different groups under 8 different leaders and theological doctrines presented themselves to the Arabs as the true representatives of Egypt's Christian population. Some of these smaller groups, such as the Aristotelian leading followers of John Philoponus, derisively referred to as Tritheists, found their base among urban sophisticates in Alexandria. But still more survived in the monasteries, including the successors of Peter. And many of these monasteries had the dual benefit of functioning as parish churches, which were used by local communities, and which provided pulpits for those religious leaders who did not receive state sanction. This meant that John's position as a kind of overseer kept him in the front lines of doctrinal disputes that characterized the theological landscape of early Islamic Egypt. In a land where doctrinal allegiance, even within monastic communities, was far from static, John's oversight of the monasteries, particularly in a period in which many of the monasteries were apparently being rebuilt, made him an important leader in the battle on the ground for Christian Egypt's soul. At some point before the end of the 7th century, John's career as Mudabbir and bishop was cut short. John's contemporary, the Archdeacon George, reports that shortly after taking up his position, John was removed from it. Under his watch, a group of monks had kidnapped and assaulted a woman in Wadi Habib. Word quickly spread and John was forced to act in his position as Mudabbir. He elected to have the ringleader of the group beaten, and this was done so brutally, apparently by John himself, that the monk died of his wounds a few days later. The brutality of this beating apparently did not sit well with a number of the bishops of Egypt, who assembled a secret meeting and summoned John to explain himself. This assembly ultimately decided to reduce him to the rank of brother monk. It is not clear what George meant by saying that the meeting was conducted in secret, but given that the final word on John's fate was delivered by the bishops collectively, this may have meant that the punishment was delivered without the knowledge of the patriarch. John's successor, John of Nikiu, did not view him as particularly objectionable, given his favorable cameo in the life of Isaac of Alexandria. But John's life and works otherwise seem to have disappeared, from the written records of the church. His summary deposition by the bishops also reveals the great degree of common power that the bishops were apparently capable of exercising independent of their Syrian patriarch. Not only were they able to depose John, but they were able to appoint his successor without protest from the patriarch Simeon. This story is also preceded, I should note as well, by an account which emphasizes the unpopularity of the patriarch both among the people of Alexandria and its leading clergy. Don't have much time to get into it, but essentially there's an attempted poisoning of Simeon. The patriarch's sensitive position and the relative unity of the Egyptian bishops below him may indicate that John simply found himself on the wrong side of a poorly recorded power struggle within the ranks of the anti-Chalcedonian episcopate. The chronicle itself was likely written at some point in his bishopric, but it is impossible to know exactly when. After it was written, the text remained very obscure. No Coptic or Arabic manuscripts or fragments of the text has survived, and John himself does not appear in the papyrological record. To further complicate matters, there is evidence that John apparently edited the chronicle at least once, and that the work of editing was left incomplete. Philip Booth noted that the synopses available in the table of contents sometimes refer, and I quote here, to episodes absent from the main text. He goes on to write, "This suggests, therefore, that while the coverage of the rubrics is far from perfect, they nevertheless represent an earlier version of the chronicle." While it is unclear whether John or a later editor was responsible for this discrepancy, nevertheless suggests that before the text was translated into Ge'ez, and likely before it was translated into Arabic, some episodes were removed, and some, we can presume, were inserted. What we can say with certainty is that the text was selected for translation, and likely abbreviation, by a Copto-Arabic author. The date of this Arabic translation is unknown, and no Arabic copies of the Chronicle have survived. This murky process of transmission and abbreviation significantly changed the text in some ways, and it is unclear what was removed in the process of abbreviation. The text did not seem to enjoy much popularity among later generations of Copts eager to demonstrate bonds of solidarity between themselves and their Muslim hegemons. But the hostility of the final chapter towards the Arab invaders might be appropriate to the Bahri Mamluk period, or any other number of periods following the Arab conquest of Egypt, where tensions in relations between Copts and Muslims eventually turned into mob violence against the Christian minority. One might speculate that the text might have seen new popularity among Copts in these moments. Sergei Frantsuzov, apologies if I mispronounce his name, suggests that the text was translated and abbreviated in the 13th century on the basis of the use of a term for salary dating from the early Mamluk period, although this can only truly provide a terminus post quem. The abbreviated history would pass once more into obscurity until its arrival in late 16th century Ethiopia. It was brought to the country in the hands of an Egyptian deacon named Gabriel, and was translated into classical Ethiopic, or Ge'ez, with the assistance of an Ethiopian cleric named Meher-Gedinga, a historian in his own right, who was responsible for the composition of the first 23 chapters of the Royal Chronicle of King Susnios in the mid-17th century. Just a brief note on Ge'ez, or classical Ethiopic. Ge'ez is a Semitic language that was spoken in the Horn of Africa, and which first appeared in royal inscriptions in the late antique kingdom of Aksum in the 3rd century CE. Its alphabet is a version of the epigraphic South Arabian, which was modified in the Aksumite period to indicate vowel sounds. Ge'ez remains in use in ecclesiastical contexts to this day. So that's a sort of history of the text, and I want to add a brief word about John's contemporary audience. Because of the lack of direct citation or preservation of this text, it is difficult to determine who John's audience was or how it was received. But there are some things we can infer about his audience's interest in education in Egypt. John's Egypt was one in which Greek was a prestige language with widespread use, while a majority of the population spoke Coptic. Greek was a language of administration and some ecclesiastical ritual. Notably, for quite some time afterwards, the Easter address would be delivered in Greek. Bilingualism was common, and we know that within John's own church, the papyrological evidence suggests that some of his predecessors in ecclesiastical positions may not have known Greek at all. But the production of historical texts in this language is rare, and the Chronicle is the only known Coptic text that was not explicitly in ecclesiastical history. It would not be until the history of the Chalcedonian patriarch Eutychius in the 10th century that any such Egyptian work of history would appear again, and that in Arabic. And yet John seemed to presume that his Coptic reading audience would have had access to Greek historical texts and the ability to read them. I'll mention once more that he asked his readers to consult Byzantine authors like Procopius and Agathias for further insights on the reign of Justinian and his Italian campaigns, providing no further comments of his own. He himself made use of several notable Byzantine historians, including, of course, the 4th century Eusebius and the 6th century John Malalas. John of Nikiu apparently shared sources with the 7th century historian Theophylactos Simokata, and perhaps had access to his work on the reign of the late 6th century emperor Mauricius. We must also note that John is particularly interested in monastic affairs. We must presume his audience, if not monks, were at least interested in tales of ascetic heroism. We might imagine then that the Bishop of Nikiu's audience was much like him, bilingual, capable of engaging with Roman historians writing in Greek, but electing to write and read in a language that was particular to their location, Coptic. And I should add as well, this is arguably a Roman language in that its features and key literature emerged under Roman hegemony. In this sense, John and his audience were typically Roman. The Chronicle reads in many ways as a kind of compilation, mostly of other Byzantine and Coptic texts that we are familiar with. John Malalas' 6th century Encyclion, comprised of 18 books of history, starting with Adam and ending with the reign of the Emperor Justinian, seems to make up the lion's share of the content, as well as a number of late antique chronicles and ecclesiastical histories. John also makes reference to local events that seem to point to the use of local sources. So, given that this text seems to be primarily compilation, how could we possibly find out John's thoughts on, well, anything? Though a compilation of other texts, I believe the Chronicle still reflects the author's voice, not only in terms of the text selected for compilation, but in terms of modifications and commentary that John occasionally offers us. So a key part of my approach rests on the presumption that John did not simply use whatever was near at hand, but carefully compile the history of humanity based on texts he felt best advanced his model, even if at times this led to puzzling narratives. As an example of a puzzling narrative, I offer the following. On 2 separate occasions, John appears to express commiseration with the Gaianites, who were victims of when they were victims of state violence. I find this particularly odd because these Gaianites were Aphthartists, whose teachings were considered by John's own Miaphysite church as heretical. This is apparently irrelevant to John. His interest is in pointing out the summary execution of some Gaianites by the Chalcedonian patriarch Cyrus, and he in part blames Cyrus's brutality for Amr ibn al-As's successful invasion of Egypt. So it seems as long as an account could be used to show how cruel the Roman state had become following the acceptance of Chalcedon, John was willing to mourn these Aphthartist martyrs. So now that I've established this, I want to delve into what John was trying to do in his chronicle. As I hinted earlier, John of Nikiu tells us that his work is meant to be instructive to the lovers of virtue. As a side note, the text opens with a quote attributed to John of Nikiu, in which he addresses lovers of toil. And this, to my mind at least, could be philoponoi in Greek. It is unclear whether John meant to refer to the religious confraternities of laymen by the same name, although this is not impossible, as Eva Wipchika has noted evidence for their existence as late as the 10th century. However, there is nothing in the text, nor in the extant evidence of the life of John of Nikiu, that would confirm this. I am, however, confident that these lovers of toil are likely the same lovers of virtue we see a bit further down, and that John tells us the chronicle was meant to be a noble memorial for these people, the philoponoi, or the lovers of virtue, presumably as a collection of models of moral excellence. John's depiction of Roman history is not, as some have suggested, characterized by an animosity towards the Roman state, throughout time. Indeed, Roman emperors are covered rather dispassionately on a case-by-case basis, usually with reference to what effects their behavior had on the health of the empire. We are told, for example, that Marcus Aurelius was worthy of praise not just because of his graciousness, virtue, and justness, but indeed because he died in the religion of his father. Polytheism and idolatry is condemned throughout the text, but to die in the religion of one's father seemed acceptable to him, especially given that John seemed to believe that his father was Antoninus Pius, whom John also remembered as a virtuous and magnanimous emperor. As such, when evil emperors are depicted, it is not simply because they are pagans, or even strictly because they are hostile to Christians, but rather because their tyrannical behavior threatened in some way to do the state harm. For example, the great persecution of Christians by the Tetrarchy, is posed as a great misfortune brought on not by the state, but rather by these pagan tyrants acting in contravention of Roman norms. I think it's important to note that while Diocletian comes to power with the aid of the army, it is both the army and civil government that intervenes against him later on, casting him into exile. What is more, when the Alexandrians reject Diocletian's usurpation of the throne, it is depicted as a collective action that involved not just the notoriously riotous Alexandrians, but the local garrison and civil functionaries. In other words, when the Roman Alexandrians were confronted by Diocletian's tyranny, they resisted this tyranny along lines that would have been intimately familiar with those who knew something of the history of Rome and its institutions. Excuse me. Sorry about that. The tacit presumption of our bishop's history of Rome is that the state, that is, the collection of impersonal institutions, once established, were there to stay permanently. Indeed, while John seems to have been somewhat selective about what he took from Malalas and his other sources, he makes note of the establishment of key institutions in the Roman state and society: the construction of the capital in Rome, the establishment of a legal system, the creation of money, and the establishment of a calendar and the names of its months. That is to say, the Roman calendar and the names of its months, not the Coptic ones. On top of this, he makes an effort to point out the various ways that the Roman state affected Egypt. Everything from the establishment of Roman hegemony by Augustus to the construction of bridges and canals by various emperors, most notably the canal constructed by the Emperor Trajan. Not only are we told, or not only is it suggested really, that Rome is eternal, but that the imperial government would establish Christianity and spread it beyond the empire's boundaries non-violently. Because remember, a coerced conversion is as good as no conversion at all. And in fact, John of Nikiu explicitly chastises Mauricius for forcing heretics to become Christians, saying that this was the mark of a true Chalcedonian. So where does the decline begin? To my mind, the decline clearly begins with the Council of Chalcedon. While the Arians pose some sort of a threat, the real sort of focus of John's attention is the Council of Chalcedon. From there on, things begin to decline rapidly, and the decline itself can simply be understood as a product of God's gradual separation from the Christian citizenry of the empire. There are a number of ways by which John signaled his by which God signals his displeasure with and separation from the Christian Roman Empire in John of Nikiu's chronicle. Strange natural phenomena and natural disasters are undoubtedly John's favorite narrative tool in this respect, and he uses them almost immediately. Before the Council of Chalcedon even begins, the sky darkens when Marcian, or Marcianus, takes power. And immediately after this, natural disasters become a prominent feature of the text, and in particular, earthquakes. These are the primary means by which God repeatedly expressed his displeasure and alienation to the population at large. But the divine disappointment doesn't end there, and God, on one notable occasion, takes the time to explicitly express his disgust with his people. This is really personally a favorite story of mine in the Chronicle. I find it repeated nowhere else, and it stands out as particularly horrifying because of what it implies. So in some ways, maybe it's perfect for Halloween as well. So the story begins that shortly after the ascent of Justin I to power in 518 CE, several events occur in rapid succession, which cause an uproar in Constantinople, with both the common people and the soldiers of the city insisting that a new emperor was needed. They turn to God directly and ask for a good emperor, and I quote here, like Anastasius. I should point out that the reference to Anastasius is there because Anastasius was remembered as sympathetic to the Miaphysite position against Chalcedon. God hears their prayers and responds to them through a man in the crowd called Gamos. Gamos, in the Ethiopic text, stands up and tells the people, and I quote here, my own translation, "Look, I love you. For what reason do you beseech me? Behold, I gave you that one, that is the Emperor Justin, and I will not permit another except for him. Because if he had acted according to what was written, that is to say, if he had obeyed God's law, you would be asking this very same thing of the enemies of the king, rather than your God. It is because of the sins of the city that I have appointed this emperor, the enemy of the good. So says the Lord, I will give you rulers according to your own hearts. So first, I just want to say very quickly, I love that John has God cite himself in the third person. It's bizarre in some ways, but it's useful. Second, the last line is a poetic inversion of Jeremiah 3:15, in which God states that he will provide his people with, and I quote, shepherds after their own heart, who will feed you with knowledge, and understanding. The clever inversion of this reference serves to highlight the gradual decline of God's relationship with humanity in his role as divine kingmaker, an important recurring theme of the Chronicle. While Justin's new magistrates managed to quiet the unrest, John reminds the reader that the city's efforts were for naught, and the next account is that of a devastating earthquake at Antioch. So even after the people, right, this is the real horror, even after the people had recognized the errors that they had fallen into, even after they directly appeal to God to, spare them this horror, they're immediately rejected, and they find themselves unable to save themselves by divine appeal. This punishment was clearly meant to last for some time and to escalate, reaching its height with the loss of territories, first to the Persians and then to the Arab conquest. This is not the first time God speaks directly to the people, to his people in the text, but it is noticeably the last time he does so. Even Gabriel and Meherkadingan, the Ge'ez translators of the Arabic translation of the Chronicle of John of Nikiu, seem to have understood that the point of John's argument was to show the gradual decline of the Roman state. At the end of their translation, they give us a good synopsis of John's Chronicle, describing it as an account of the horrors which had befallen Christian apostates. Earthquakes, the destruction of Nicaea, and other disasters are listed, until finally we are told that the Roman emperors lost the imperial crown to the Ishmaelites and Huzians, and the Huzians here I assume mean the Sasanian Persians, because they had, quote, divided that which is indivisible. Technically, I don't think this is correct, as the Romans continued to hold power elsewhere, but nevertheless, the point is well taken. Gabriel Meherkadingan believed that the core argument in the text was that Egypt was lost to the Romans because of their alienation from God. This alienation occurred because the Roman state had taken up the Chalcedonian Diophysite theology. So at this point, those of you who are still with me might be wondering what is so temporary about this end of Roman hegemony in Egypt. One of the last things John writes about is about the horror of the Arab occupation of Alexandria. In particular, he notes that Amr called for high monthly taxes, so high, in fact, that the residents were forced to sell their children in order to make these payments. Others fled to the caverns, or to nearby caverns. John tells us that despite this suffering, God would ultimately defeat the Arabs, who are alternatively referred to as Muslims, or more properly in the text itself, Islam. This is a term that John uses where others might use Muslim, and Ishmaelites. He repeats this twice in the account of the Arab conquest of Egypt. This is hardly an apocalyptic reading, and I think it's safe to say that without explicit mention of any other Christian polity, unlike Pseudo-Samuel of Kalamun, who enthusiastically tells his audience that Greeks, presumably Romans, and Abyssinians would join together and liberate Egypt, that the Romans were expected to take back Egypt, provided, of course, that they met certain preconditions. Though it is fairly clear what the most important precondition is, namely a return to true Christianity via Miaphysite orthodoxy, John tells us this explicitly through prophetic characters. For example, Abba Jeremiah, a holy man from Alexandria, or near Alexandria, tells the emperor Anastasios, then not yet an emperor and banished into exile, that if he did not transgress against the Christian faith, and if he rejected Chalcedonianism, God would save him from his enemies. The deposed patriarch of Antioch, Severus, is also credited with prophesying in a letter to the same emperor Anastasios that no Roman son would sit on his father's throne as long as the decision of the Council of Chalcedon remained in effect. This is a prophecy that would be repeated later in the text and find its fulfillment in the exceedingly short reign of Constantine III in 641 CE. There are other notable prophecies, but I've listed the ones I think most remain to the discussion at hand. And there's a notable pattern in this collection of prophetic holy men to whom John of Nikiu gives voice. They are all anti-Chalcedonia, apart from Athanasius, whose teachings were embraced by anti-Chalcedonians. And they are all Egyptians, apart from Severus of Antioch, who spent several years in exile in Egypt. They are all monks or closely associated with monks, figures who, at least since the 5th century CE, were understood as possessing mantic powers. More importantly, it hints at a broader theme that, in some way, the key to the empire's rediscovery of orthodoxy could best be uncovered through monastic practice, or at least some kind of asceticism. We've already briefly spoken about Abba Jeremiah. This is a fine example of the special relationship that John believed monastic practitioners should have with the Roman state as direct advisors. But John expected even more of his future emperors, and he indeed praises the Western Emperor Honorius not for any particular government policy or military success, but rather for his chastity, purity, and asceticism. Just to highlight this point, I have one more story from an unlikely portion of the Chronicle that serves to highlight this interest in the intersection between asceticism and imperial government, John's account of the reign of Diocletian. We are told that the Emperor Diocletian, after a bout of a vaguely defined physical illness, which soon turned into psychological illness, the Senate saw its opportunity and sent the Emperor Diocletian to an island named Wados, which John described as being in the west and covered with great forests. As a side note, I really have yet to identify this place. So if anyone has a sense of what this might be, of what Wados might be a mistransliteration of, please let me know. To my knowledge, there is no place named Wados, although this is, this whole account is sort of reminiscent of Diocletian's first retirement to his Dalmatian palace. Diocletian, in the narrative of John of Nikiu, is left alone on this island, and his only contact is with some kindly Christians who had survived the persecutions and brought him enough daily food just to keep him alive. John tells us that the solitary living gradually helped Diocletian return to his senses, at least until he became desirous of power again. Once he was rebuked by the Senate and army for the last time, he once again lost his sanity, went blind, and so died. I think this story is particularly interesting for a few reasons. It does not appear anywhere else in Byzantine historical writing, nor does it appear in the dozens of Coptic hagiographies detailing the persecutions of Diocletian, some of which John clearly used as part of his source material. But what I find most interesting is that John of Nikiu seemed to be suggesting that one did not even have to be a Christian to see the physical and spiritual benefits of an ascetic lifestyle. We are told later in the text that Diocletian was in fact suffering as a result of sorcery performed on him by his colleague Maximianus, and that this was set right only by his adherence to a life of isolation and meager sustenance. It's hard to draw much more out of this, but I find it particularly interesting that John or his source seemed to believe that one could benefit spiritually from a kind of secular asceticism. Perhaps this is the sort of humility or behavior that he sought in his emperors. To conclude, what can we draw from this? John clearly believed, to my mind, that Roman dominion might eventually return to Egypt, but that this new Rome that returned to Egypt would have to look fundamentally different if it had truly regained God's favor. The path, he believed, lay in a return to orthodoxy, and that path could best be navigated through some kind of ascetic practice. This was likely directed at our above-mentioned audience, the lovers of toil or the lovers of virtue, eager for tales of monastic heroism and spiritual athleticism. I want to suggest that this history, in its ideological orientation, reflects a post-Roman ideology that was centered around monastic practice. John used as his framework the Byzantine genre of the universal chronicle to present an ethically prescriptive meta-narrative of world history, which explained the long-term consequences of the ethical successes and shortcomings of individual actors. This ethical approach enabled him to connect the community of Egyptian Christians to a long and distinctly Roman Christian tradition. In other words, John sought to remind his Coptic reading audience that they were still, in some way, part of the Christian Roman world by showing them how their actions could have some sort of impact on the well-being of all Christians, despite the fact that by his own time, doctrinal disputes and a half-century of alienation from the Roman Empire had substantially separated Egypt from Rome. On a final and maybe only tangentially related note, perhaps this text is best understood not as a world history or a chronicle, but something related to the long dead category of Munchchronik, or monkish chronicles or monkish histories. Now, I don't want to present to you this category in the terms in which Karl Krumbacher presented it, as a kind of lowbrow, titillating pop literature reflecting a deterioration of education, or the collapse of a refined stylistic, or a collapse of the refined stylistic niceties that characterize the high history of the Procopian type. Nor do I wish to suggest that this was a widely practiced genre to which such diverse works as the Encyclion of John Malalas, the work of John of Antioch, or the work of George Sinkedos can be easily assigned. I also wish to steer away from the notion of understanding it in Herbert Hunger's terms as a kind of trivial literature, characterized by simple language, broad popular appeal, and an emphasis on entertainment. Instead, I think this renewed category emphasizes the use of the chronicle as a tool by which monks and their, let's say, fans could understand their identity and historical role in the future Christian Roman Empire by providing historical arguments in favor of an ascetic life, or perhaps more specifically, a monastic life under Severan Theodosian oversight. Thank you very much for your time.
So thank you very much, Felege, for this, for providing this really fascinating and comprehensive presentation of late antique Egypt through the analysis of John of Nikiu's chronicle. And I have many questions because I must confess my ignorance about this topic, which is, I think that anyone can see it is, I mean, it's really difficult. It needs, you know, a knowledge of so many languages, so many different and difficult languages that really I am overwhelmed by admiration towards you. Really, that was fantastic. So before, okay, maybe before my comment or questions, I could ask anyone who is here with us today to, I don't know if you have already seen it, but you can just write C or Q in our chat box, and I will give you the floor if you want to, oh, yes, so we have a question from Edward Watts. Please, Edward.
Sure. Felege, I love this. This was really wonderful. And as Carlos said, this is there's such comprehensive work with so many complicated range of materials. So I wanted to ask a question. I'm going to try to articulate it, and I may not succeed in articulating it very well. But the question basically is, it's very interesting that John of Nikiu has this kind of lived experience of the basically life in a monastery under a kind of different imperial power. How does he maybe imagine the reality of Roman rule? If the Romans do come back, how does that work with his conception of a lived experience, which obviously he's spending a lot of time moderating and governing this kind of ascetic behavior in the monasteries, sometimes well, sometimes it seems quite poorly. How does he understand larger dynamics of imperial power centered on this idea of asceticism working in practice, or does he actually even care about it working in practice?
I think what he seems to believe is that, you know, regardless of, you know, an individual emperor, or it goes below emperors, right? A particular governor, general, magistrate. Regardless of how, you know, to our eyes, poor their decision-making processes might be, so long as they have God's favor, the outcome will be positive, both for them and for the state at large. And I think that's what's key there. I think he doesn't seem to conceive of these institutions as needing to be governed by particularly competent men, at least within the text. What's most important for them, beyond their competence, their ability to do certain things, is, having the favor of God. And he seems to suggest at points, in particular in the Arab conquest narrative, that if one has lost favor with God, or if one is, sort of, let's say, theologically incorrect, right, or is not a particularly good Christian, that this in turn leads to the kinds of moral failures that makes one a bad general or administrator. I mean, the sort of number of negative things that he has to say about the military men in charge of Egypt when the Arabs arrived, good enough for me, right? They're all Chalcedonians, but that's never just enough for him. Like, one general, John, is Chalcedonian, also gluttonous and fat, right? So it's not that he is gluttonous and fat in and of itself that causes, his inability to respond effectively to the Arabs. Rather, the first mistake that he made was accepting Chalcedon, right? What follows from this is his lethargy and gluttony, and this is why, the Arabs are particularly successful on this front. You have that done as well with sort of individual cowardice on the field. So I believe it's the General Theodore when he abandons his post and allows the Arabs to run roughshod. Again, it's not just that he was cowardly to begin with, it's that first he was Chalcedonian. This, of course, leads to the character defect, and then, right, the effect occurs. So I think the core problem is always that these people are theologically misguided. I don't know if that quite answers the question.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. Yeah.
So are there any other questions or comments for Felege?
I'd love comments, by the way. This is, to my mind anyway, very much a work in progress. So I'll take any help I can get.
So, okay. So we have another, I see a raised hand. So please. Yes, okay.
If I may, I'm not very familiar with the author, but I learned that he knew something of the works of Procopius and Malalas, and he also expected some of his readers to know these texts. Now, I would be interested in whether your author mentions the Great Plague of the age of Justinian in the 6th century in any way, directly or indirectly, as a sign of decline or as a punishment of God, because other historians in the 6th, 7th centuries made very much of this plague and its consequences.
So thank you very much for this question. He does mention the plague. The funny thing about his account of the plague and his account of the reign of Justinian in general is that it's horrors piled on horrors. So by the time you get to the plague, you almost miss it, right? It's sort of snuck in there alongside several earthquakes at Antioch, which are also mentioned by John Malalas. He also mentions that an entire town in Egypt just sort of sinks into the ground and disappears just in a day, just collapses and everyone's gone. The houses are all gone. It's just flat earth again. And so he does mention the plague, right? But it's, how do I put this? It doesn't strike the reader as something special, right? It's one among a number of horrors that are brought on by Justinian's, particularly sort of aggressive implementation of a Chalcedonian theology. So that's the sort of thing, or I guess that's the sort of best I can give you here. It really just disappears into the narrative. Yeah, so it is mentioned.
So maybe I can also ask you something, because so the plague has been mentioned as, okay, a sign of decline, and you had said that it almost disappears in the long series of disasters that John tells us. But I was wondering, what about the end of the Western Roman Empire? Are there any mentions in John's Chronicle? And does he, see it in a particular way? Does he consider it a sign of decline or a sign of the end of the world, like perhaps it was intended in the western half of the Mediterranean? And I would also ask, does the Western history, does it have a special, well, not a special, does it have a place in John's chronicle, or is, his optic is just Eastern and doesn't care really much about that far lands in the north or in the west?
Absolutely. So these are great questions, and I should note as well, things I have to investigate a little more closely. I will say in general, it seems as though you're right. His attention is mostly towards the East. He does mention the collapse of the West. He has an interest in muting, how big of a deal this is. In part because Zeno is famous for this Henoticon, and the Henoticon for John of Nikiu becomes like a sort of gold standard of sort of theological unity, right? This is the standard by which all emperors should adhere. And he sort of juxtaposes it with the Tome of Leo. So in some sense, it's a little muted, but he does eventually mention it. He simply mentions 475 as a point at which a barbarian king comes and calls himself the king of the Romans, and Zeno is reported as being more or less okay with the situation. I will say in terms of Western history in general, as a general rule, if it's not something that was preserved in Malalas, he seems sort of indifferent to them, right? There are exceptions to this, right? The Emperor Honorius being a notable exception to this. He's particularly interested in what happens on that front. But Attila's movements in the West, Germanic invasions, all of these things or migrations, excuse me. None of these are a big point of interest for John of Nikiu. And I think that might represent the conceits of the Eastern aristocracy at this time, right? The West is, to their mind, just the edge of the world, and not a sort of center of focus for high politics.
Absolutely, yes, because because I'm more familiar with 5th century history in the West, and you get absolutely this impression that the Eastern Roman Empire didn't care so much about what was happening in the West in the 5th century. So I presume that the more, in the 7th, in the 6th, and in the 7th century, this it's much more evident, like in John of Nikiu's Chronicles. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. And I just want to add as well, this is why this may be something I may restrict to just one chapter of my monograph, or even just as a separate series of articles. But I'm very interested in comparing John of Nikiu's writing to that of Fredegarius, writing roughly around the same time, depending on questions of authorship.
Yes.
In Burgundy, yeah, that's a whole mess. And the Chronicle of Zuchnin. I think there are a variety of responses to the sort of absence of Roman hegemony, or the recent absence of Roman hegemony, but it necessarily has to be this sort of vestigial ideology is going to have necessarily different expressions. In the case of, say, the post-Roman West, right, and post-Roman Burgundy, or in Syria. So I just want to add that last note.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Are there any other? Yes, we have perhaps a question by Alessio Borselli.
Thank you. Thank you, Ferrari, and thank you, Selam Solomon. I want to ask a question, because when you talk about the natural disasters that are a consequence of bad decisions by emperors or rulers, in some way we can say that God punishes the sinners by these types of natural disasters. And I remind of Gregory of Tours, because also in Gregory of Tours, natural disasters are interesting, because almost all the researchers or the historians, all the people who commented his text are, they say that this is the only sure moment where God shows himself in his histories. Lots of historians misreads this thing, so they thought that the presence of God is more is everywhere, almost everywhere, in every place of the histories of Gregory of Tours, and but this is not true. Einzelman demolished, destroyed this type of lecture, and but in Gregory of Tours, the history is finished. The history is finished with the ruin of the Merovingian dynasty, with the Roi Finessant, with this sort of puppets kings that are in the hands of the nobility. There is not an eschatological exit from this tragedy, historical tragedy, and is in John of Nikiu an eschatological exit, not something like the John Apocalypse, but an eschatological, a positive exit from a situation where the Council of Chalcedon alienates Egyptian people and Christians from power.
Yeah, this is honestly something I struggle with, right? So I feel comfortable saying this isn't apocalyptic, but what to make of the accounts afterwards is incredibly difficult. On the one hand, you'll have John of Nikiu saying, you know, when the Arabs arrive, it's more or less okay. They don't, you know, they don't destroy the churches. They don't excessively tax the churches. You know, some people are more or less left alone. And then in the very next paragraph, right, he's saying, the horrors visited upon us by the Arabs, these excessive taxes, forced conversions, you know, people being murdered, having to sell their children. And it's very hard to get a grip exactly on how he wants us to perceive the Arabs, right? There are definitely points at which he seems to say this could have been far worse. You know, thank God it didn't. You know, the best reading of this that I can take is that this, you know, the fact that the churches were spared, right, as a general rule, but the people were not, is some sort of indication of again, this idea that the Romans are going to come back, that Christianity is not done in this part of the world. You know, the institutions will remain, the people will be punished, and they'll be punished in horrible ways that have no pedagogical value whatsoever, right? You can't learn the lesson God's trying to teach you if you've been, you know, killed by the lesson. But the institutions, right, in their physical representation, as well as in the continuity of the patriarchate, right, the return of Benjamin from his exile and the expulsion of Cyrus, there you find, right, the continuity of institutions. As to whether that's eschatological, I couldn't say to be certain. What I feel confident saying, just in this particular moment, is that it seems to tacitly suggest, you know, just as was the case with the Sasanian occupation of Egypt, this may take a very long time, but eventually it will end, and you know, the Christian rule in Egypt would be restored. I don't know if this quite answers. Does this quite answer?
Yeah, okay. I understood the answer. Thank you.
I'd love to talk about this more as well, particularly.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
So I see that there are some comments of people that have left, but have said thank you very much and compliments to the speaker. So from Cecilia Ricci, for example, but I don't see oh yes, Livingston Dilworth, yeah, please.
Hello, Livingston.
Hello, Felege. So with your knowledge of classical Ethiopian and being able to read it, and then are you familiar with Coptic? Can you read and translate it?
Yes.
Okay. So
oh, sorry, what's that?
With that in mind, have you been able to notice the tone and the word choice that John uses during his characterization of the Arab sort of apocalyptic idea and how that compares to his more, I guess, detrimental view of the like Chalcedonian beliefs? Does that make sense? Like, are you able to find a thread between the two in his word choice and the way that he sort of identifies things as an issue?
Right. It's difficult to get at, and I've as a general rule tried to stay away from doing too much. I fail at this sometimes, but I try to avoid reading too much into the Ethiopic because it's also filtered through the Arabic, right? And so it's sort of hard to get at, the Coptic of it. There are hints of the Coptic in it. You can see points, for example, where the transcription of a name has been completely mangled. In such a way that you can identify, say, a Coptic, say, definite article marker, right? The pa or p. So there's a part of the Nile River called P, or the dragon, right? So P Drakon. That P is a Coptic article. In terms of how the Arabs are depicted, if this isn't answering your question, please let me know. They're almost another natural disaster. The lead figures aren't given much characterization. They're generally always destroying something, stealing something, or taking something in terms of taxes. But they aren't themselves given any kind of characterization. They're not described as particularly pious or particularly ascetic, things of this nature. And I think it fits in rather well, frankly, not just with how the Arabs are depicted, but certainly how a lot of barbarian peoples are depicted in Roman literature. I think this happens quite often, right? Where you get these people depicted almost as a kind of natural disaster that sweeps through a city or sweeps through a particular province, much like an earthquake or a flood. And there's little reasoning behind their action. We're never told that, for example, Rugila, raids in Thrace because he wanted X, Y, and Z. It's usually because someone on the Roman side messed up somehow, usually theologically, and this is why we have this, and this is why these barbarians have arrived. They are we talked about it in our class on the Huns today, right? They are punishments from God. They're Felege-Selam Dei. Is that the answer? Okay. Livingstone's my student. She's good. She's very good.
Okay, so this is perfect. Let's see if there are other questions or comments to Felege's presentation. Right now, I don't see any. Well, so it seems that everybody is happy with that. Edward, what do you say?
Sure. So I guess we can all again thank Felege for a really wonderful talk that showed incredible range of just skills and materials, and I think was perfect for the seminar series and the kinds of questions that we're asking about what it means when a society undergoes stress and how decline can be conceptualized. So I'm going to just switch to a quick visual for what's remaining in the seminar series. So we have on November 19th, the talk by Cam Gray of the University of Pennsylvania that will look at ancient and modern histories of disaster and writing the fall of Rome. And then the final talk will be on January 7th, and will actually be a special event because I am coming to Florence, and we will have a joint talk a joint event by me and Giovanni Ciccone, where we will basically kind of try to sum up some of the bigger concepts and talk about some of the work that we're doing as well. So I very, very strongly encourage all of you to tune in for the next two talks. And in the meantime, let's please again thank Felege for a really wonderful discussion. And we will look forward to seeing everybody in 3 short weeks. So thank you, everyone.